So I'd like to invite you to open with me to Matthew chapter 16. Lately, over the past number of weeks, we've been sort of grounded in John 17, which is the high priestly prayer of Jesus. We're in a series that we're calling Being Believers in the World. And what we've been doing together is kind of exploring this question: what does it mean to Jesus for us to be believers in the world? And, like I mentioned last week, it's a question I really had never given much thought to. I hadn't really considered that much. But in the course of working through some of these passages, it just sort of dawned on me that we all have our experiences and our expectations, our understandings, and sometimes we even really want to clarify, either to ourselves or to others, what we mean by I'm a believer, or I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus. And it sort of begs the question, well, doesn't it matter more what it means to Jesus for us to be believers in the world? Wouldn't his priority for what that means be more important than our idea of it? Shouldn't that become our priority? And I understand that you ask a big question like that, well, the answer is basically this, right? So I in no way are we attempting here to say, well, in 4 weeks, I'm just going to tell you everything there is to know about what it means to Jesus for you to be a believer in the world. But rather, we've been rooted in John 17 as this high priestly prayer that as we listen to Jesus talk to the Father about his disciples and all of us disciples who would follow, then we get a great picture of what is burning on his heart, what's burning in his spirit, therefore what's coming from the Father, on what it is that they're longing and yearning and designing for his church to be. And actually today, as I asked you to turn to Matthew 16, instead we're sort of taking a little bit of a field trip from John 17 to Matthew 16. And the reason why is because this is, to me, in this question, kind of an essential place where the question is asked directly by Jesus about who people believe he is. And we are going to look at Peter as an example of someone who not only is a believer, but what Jesus says about that and what that means for all of us sort of helps us as we look at that broader question. So that's why we're taking some time here, and hopefully all of that connection will make sense as we go. A couple of weeks ago, as we began, let me just sort of recap for you. Here are some things that we were seeing together. Number one, that the Father loves you dearly. If you are a believer, a follower of Jesus, if you belong to Jesus, the Father loves you dearly. I'm not saying he doesn't love you if you haven't made a decision for Jesus. What I'm saying is you're becoming one with Christ by your faith being put in Jesus, sets upon you a fatherly affection that God has for his own Son. So maybe a better way of putting it is that the Father loves you dearly. He listens and responds to you like he does to his own Son, Jesus, because you love and believe his Son. So you are brought into the family as a son, as a daughter, that he loves dearly and listens to and responds to just the same way as his only begotten Son. That's really astonishing. And then another thing we were seeing at the end of John 16 is Jesus said, hey, what does it mean to be a believer in the world? Well, in this world you'll have trouble. There will be trials and sorrows. But take heart, I have overcome the world. And then thirdly, from 2 weeks ago, my peace, the peace that he gives us, is the loving presence of the Father through Jesus. So it's not the absence of trouble, it's not the absence of sorrow, it's not the presence of this need or that health or this money or that position or that respect or that relationship or whatever, but the peace that he offers us is the very presence of the Father through Jesus. And I understand that maybe if you've been in church for a while, you hear that and you're like, well, yeah, duh. But no, it's not yeah, duh. Because remember, that came specifically directly from Jesus as he was walking to the cross. On that night before he went to the cross, he tells his disciples, you're all going to scatter, you're all going to leave me alone, but I'm telling you this, I will not be alone because my Father's with me. That's his peace. So it's a rock solid peace. Okay, then last week we talked about this. Jesus is the Lord of glory. He holds all authority and life itself for all eternity. So a pretty big deal. And yet, he was sent by the Father into the world, the cross, the grave, resurrected from the grave, victorious over all death, all hell, all sin. But the point is that even though he ended up as the total, complete, indisputed victor, and even though he came to the world as the Lord of glory with all authority, life itself for all eternity, all of that was directly from our passage last week. In the middle part, he was sent, which means that he submitted to the Father, right? He had to believe and trust the Father. He belonged to the Father, which means not only the benefits of belonging as his son, but also he was under the ownership, the direction, the leadership of the Father. And he was sent with a mission to do, a job to do, while he was on this earth from the Father. And so Jesus said, just as I was sent, so I'm sending you. And therefore, we too, we believe and trust him, who he is and what he said and what he's doing. We belong to him, which means not only all of the benefits and the beauty and the wonder of being a part of his family, belonging to him, having a place to belong, but it also means we're under his ownership. We're under his authority. He has the right to send us. And in fact, he says, as I've been sent, so I'm sending you. So no matter where you go, no matter where you are, no matter what's going on in your life, hey, let's remind each other, you are sent. You're here with a job to do. And so we're becoming all that he's designed for us to be. So anyways, like I said, we're taking a brief field trip from John 17. That's where we've been, to Matthew 16 now, because here's a place illustrated through Peter where we see what it means to Jesus for us to be believers in the world. So I'm going to read that for us here, and you can follow along with me. This is Matthew 16, and we'll read verse 13 through 20. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Wow, that's a deep word. There's a lot in there. We're going to spend our time there this morning. I also have to say, just side note, I got a different Bible. And it's so cool because I can read it. Some of you who have known me for a while, I've been here for a long time, me and my family, so I know some of you are delighted to know that I could no longer read the small print in my small Bible. You've been telling me for years. Well, guess what? So it just feels good as I can actually see it. It's kind of cool. All right. Scratch that from the record. Let's move on. Jesus says, who do you say I am? He asked this question, do people, what are people saying I am? Now, last week when we began John 17 and he started this prayer, Father, glorify me. And we talked about how Jesus prayed this prayer. He started this prayer in a way that none of us could ever pray. Here he says, what are people saying about me? And boy, that's not a good look for a lot of us. That's not really the kind of question, even though we're all asking it internally, or we want to know what people think of us. And it seems a little bit like, I don't know, is Jesus being insecure here? Of course not. Of course he's not. Obviously he's leading to the big question, but that question of like, well, who do people say I am? I can honestly say I hope I'm never one of those guys that's like, do you know who I am? Because it's just, who talks like that? Who gets to ask that kind of question? Usually it's not a really nice person who would say, do you know who I am? I heard a story, maybe you have too, about a student who was taking a final exam. And it was a really difficult course and a long essay final exam. And the professor was known to be kind of a pain and a real stickler on all the rules, and had delivered a very strict instruction that this is the time that the exam begins. You're going to open your blue book. You're going to write like crazy. And when time is up, you will not write another word. You will close the blue book and you will turn it in. And if you continue to write after it's closed, the time is up, then you'll fail. And so the exam went on, and everyone's sweating and writing their things, and the time was up, and all the students closed their books, but there's this one student who just kept on feverishly writing, and for another 15, 20, 30 seconds, finished the thought that he was working on, and he closed his book, and everyone had already gone up to put their book there on the desk, and he walked up, and and the professor said, you realize I can't accept that. He said, well, I know, sir, but I needed to finish the thought that I was on. I wasn't adding anything to it. I just had to complete it. And he said, no, I told you that if you keep writing, then you're not going to, I won't be able to accept your exam. And the student looked at him. He said, do you have any idea who I am? And the professor said, no. And he said, good. And he opened up the stack of blue books, put it in the middle somewhere, and walked off. Jesus says, who do people say I am? And the disciples, well, there's a lot of opinions out there. There's a lot of ideas out there. There's stuff going around. Some people say you're a prophet. Some people even name some prophets, like maybe you're Elijah, maybe you're Jeremiah, you're a good teacher. There's lots of opinions. And honestly, if you were to ask that question today, you would get a very similar answer. Maybe people wouldn't say Elijah or Jeremiah, but you would get a similar answer in that it would be just, all kinds of different opinions. If you say, who's Jesus? And really what people want you to ask is, who's Jesus to you? As though whatever Jesus is to them, well, then that's just who Jesus is. Right? And it's funny because none of us would ever want to be treated that way, right? We all know and love Steve. Okay, well, some of us know Steve. And, sorry, just a little bit. So Steve is right here. Steve is there, and if you want to know Steve, you gotta get to know Steve. It would never be fair to say, well, who is Steve to you? No one would ever say that. Maybe his family would. Well, he's my husband, whatever, because of special bond, special relationship. But who is Steve to you? It doesn't matter. The question is, who is Steve? Well, if you ask people, who is Jesus, they're going to have all kinds of different opinions and perspectives. And some of them are, close, and some of them sound kind of crazy. But I've always felt like Jesus should have the right to answer that question for himself. Isn't that what you would want? Wouldn't you want people to know you personally before they decide who you are? And so when Jesus says, who are people saying I am? He's not saying, who am I? He's saying, who are people saying I am? He knows who he is. And now he turns to them. He says, yeah, but who do you say I am? You see, there's lots of opinions, but there's just one truth. Who gets to decide who Jesus really is? Jesus. That's it. And that's the same thing that you would expect. I want to stop here for a moment and as before we move further through this passage and just give you sort of the key points that are unfolded here, rather than building them as we go. I just want to lay them out for you right now, and then that way we can use the rest of our time to kind of walk through some of these. The reason why is because this progression is really important as we go through this passage. So let me just lay them out for you one by one here. All right? So number one, you must align yourself with your own answer to that question. Now, the reason why I'm saying that way at this moment is because I know we were just saying there's lots of opinions about Jesus, but who gets to decide the truth? Jesus does. So when I say that you must align yourself with your own answer to that question, I am not saying that your own answer is right. Jesus' answer to who I am is right. Yeah? Your answer will either conform to that and also be right, or it will not conform to that and it will be wrong. But either way, here's the point. You personally have to answer the question. And your life will align with your answer to that question. You might be right, you might be wrong. My suggestion is get to know him. Know him. He's here. He's showing himself. He's putting the truth out there. But either way, you must align your life with your own answer to that question. No one else's answer, no one else's opinion will do. Your life will align with your answer to that question. And so I just ask you now, have you ever answered that question? Have you ever read this and hear Jesus say, "Who do you say I am?" Have you ever stopped and said, who do I say Jesus is? I know many of you have. But I want you to know this morning that if you never have, or if you've just taken everybody else's answer around you as your own, and you've never stopped to say, yeah, but who do I say he is? And decide for yourself, he is who he says he is. He's the way, he's the truth, he's the life. The Son of God, the Son of Man. When you know who he is and you align yourself with that, then everything else in your life becomes aligned accordingly. It changes everything. And everyone must answer that question. If you haven't yet, today's the day. Jesus is asking you, who do you say I am? And you can't go another day without answering that question. Number two, the Father is passionate about people believing and experiencing him. I'll unpack this a little bit more in a minute, but one of the things that's happening in here is that we're seeing the Father's passion that people believe his Son. Number three, Jesus is relentlessly building his unstoppable church, one believer at a time. You heard that in the passage. We'll get to there in just a moment. Number four, God has delegated kingdom authority to his church in the world. All right, so there we go. You must align yourself with your own answer to the question. The Father is passionate about people believing and experiencing him. Jesus is relentlessly building his unstoppable church, one believer at a time. And four, God has delegated kingdom authority to his church in the world. Now, are we going to get through all of that? I hope so. But if we don't, now you have the answers. And we can come back to it later. So Jesus says, who do people say I am? Who gets to decide? Jesus does. And he asked each of us, who do you say I am? Because that is the question, the central question. Last week we talked briefly about how Jesus is not one of many valid options. That's not his position at all. It's a common position today that there's a lot of valid options, and Jesus is one of them. But doesn't it matter that Jesus doesn't take that position? That's not where he stands. It's not what he says about himself. Jesus is so intolerant that not only does he say there is only one truth, but he insists that he is truth. You hear what I'm saying? Jesus asked this question, who do you say I am, from the position that literally nothing else in the disciples' life in your life, my life, anyone's life, is more important, more consequential, more defining than this. It's one thing to say, I am truth. It's another thing even more to say, and nothing else in your life matters more than your answer to who I am. That's not a particularly tolerant position, is it? At least not how we would define it in our culture today. In fact, in the moment when Peter replies his answer, which was the correct answer, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, Jesus' response is, God told you that. You see, like it just gets harder and clearer and more defined. Jesus Christ is Christ-centered. He is so Christ-centric that when Peter says, you are the Christ, Jesus literally says, you are blessed by God that you even know that. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by the Father in heaven. So not only is he saying, yes, you're right that I'm the Messiah, the Son of the living God, but God told you that, and you're blessed by God that you even know that. Now, please don't misunderstand. We are absolutely not suggesting here that Jesus is arrogant, or that he's rude, or that he's self-seeking, or that he's proud. In fact, if you're asking the question, why is Jesus so Jesus-centered? Here's the answer. It's because Jesus Christ is love. He is God, and God is love. You know where I'm going. 1 Corinthians 13, listen. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. So how is it possible that Jesus can take that answer and say, not only are you right, but God told you that, and you're blessed because of it, and at the same time not be boastful or proud or self-seeking or any of those things? Because it's true. That's why. And Jesus rejoices in the truth. And I want you to catch that this morning because Jesus is delighted that Peter gives this answer, because Jesus is rejoicing in the truth. When Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus rejoices. He says, blessings. Blessings. Blessed are you. There's some excitement in Jesus' voice, I believe. Blessed are you. And it's almost like, isn't this wonderful? Isn't it wonderful that you know that? I love you, Peter. I love that you know that. I mean, when Jesus says, who are people saying I am? He knows he's going to get lots of opinions. When he asks the disciples, who do you say I am? There's a better chance that they'll get a right, or at least a pretty close to right answer. But when Peter says, you are the Christ, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of the living God, Jesus is so happy. Blessed are you, Peter. Blessings, rejoicing. Isn't this wonderful? Oh, I love you, Peter. I love that you know that. That's a really good sign, Peter. That's so good. I love the Father. I love that the Father revealed that to you. This is amazing. This is beautiful. Because he knows that that doesn't come to a person by a own person's reasoning or broken, sinful reasoning. It comes to a person through the incredible gift of grace that Jesus was sent to reveal God. And so the Father is passionate about people knowing and believing and experiencing his Son. And when Peter recognizes who he really is, I hope that you'll see this maybe with a little different kind of enthusiasm that maybe you've noticed before, that it blesses Jesus' heart. And he loves Peter, and he loves that Peter knows that, and he loves the Father. I love that the Father revealed that to you. And so, brother and sister, if you know Jesus this morning, understand this, that in and of itself delights him. He's celebrating that. That's good. That's wonderful. That's beautiful. It's miraculous. It's not a small thing. Whatever your testimony is, I've heard plenty of people, I've said it myself at different times, say, well, I've got kind of a medium grade testimony. I've got kind of a simple one. It's not one of the big flashy ones or whatever. Listen, if you know that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God, that is an awesome miracle that the Father has done, and he's delighted in it. It's a blessing. It's awesome. It's wonderful. It's worth celebrating. So, love, passion. I mean, you know John 3:16. Let's just help me out for a sec here. For God so the world that he, his one and only Son, so that whoever in him will not perish but have everlasting life. Why did the Father send Jesus? Passion, love, pursuit. And he revealed it to Peter, and he reveals it to us. And he's revealing it to the world through his church, one believer at a time. So he tells Simon here in verse 18, you are Peter. Now you probably know, you've heard before, that Peter means rock. We always call him Peter. His name before was Simon. Sometimes in Scripture we see him as Simon Peter. I just want to point out here before we go much further that what you mean by rock really makes a difference in how you understand this passage. And there's been a lot of confusion about this over the years and through church history and all kinds of stuff. So I'm kind of a simple guy. I realize there's probably a lot more in-depth complexity to all of the things that people have in their perspectives, but it matters what you mean by rock. I mean, like if Jesus told Simon, Simon, you rock. I mean, woo! And if Jesus was sitting in a rocking chair at the time, and he said, Simon, you rock, and on this rock I will build my church, we would all forever be trying to figure out how to properly build church structure and religious systems out of rock and roll and rocking chairs. We'd be all trying to figure this out. What's the relationship? How does it work? Whatever. It matters which rock he means. And so when Jesus says, Simon, you are Peter, Petros, he's saying, Peter, or Simon, you are rock. And that's like a stone, a firm, solid rock. That kind of rock. Makes sense. But then when he says, and on this rock I will build my church, he changes the word. And it's not the same word that he used before. Before he said, you are Petros, you are rock. And now he says, and on this Petra I will build my church. And that word means like bedrock, like foundation. So remember what just happened when he said, who do you say I am? And Peter confesses, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus, his heart jumps with joy. He says, yes, I love that you know that. I love that the Father revealed that to you. And he's saying, listen, Simon, you are a rock. God has put that belief, he has so fastened it to you. It is such a firm, unshakable foundation in your life. You are a rock. And on that bedrock, on that bedrock of that firm conviction, that firm belief in the truth of who Jesus is, on that bedrock, I will build my church. And the reason why that's important is because the common misunderstanding is, Peter, you're the rock, and on you, the rock, I will build my church. And that's how we get kind of the concept of this unbroken line of authority, all invested in Peter and all of the popes that follow, and you know all of the story. But that's not what he's saying here, because he says, you are Peter, the rock. I'm so delighted that you believe me. The Father revealed that to you, and you've accepted that truth, and that's a firm, solid truth. And on that bedrock, I'm going to build my church. And then he says, the gates of Hades will not overcome it. The gates of Hades is like the The gates is more than just like, the swinging doorway into hell. This is like a reference, kind of like, the council, the center of authority, the place of power, where things happen, the place where decisions are made. The council of death and hell will not overcome it. So, Peter, you're a rock. That what just happened right there, you're a rock. And on that bedrock, I will build my church, and all of the counsel and authority of death and hell will not overcome it. And then maybe you've heard, I hope you know, that word overcome is not the same word as overcome when Jesus said, I will overcome the world, because there's an offensive and a defensive version of it, right? When Jesus says, there's going to be trouble in the world, but take heart, I've overcome the world. That's an offensive overcome. But here where he says the gates of hell, all of the counsel of death and hell itself will not overpower it or not overcome it, that's a defensive stand, which means that he's building his church on that foundation, on that bedrock. It is always advancing with his kingdom. It is always coming against the very power and counsel and authority of death and hell itself, and death and hell will not be able to withstand it. I will build my church, he says. And then he says in verse 19, and this is sort of like leaning into how he will do that. He says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed on heaven. We need to take a few minutes here. I will give you the keys. That's a delegation of authority, right? Have you ever been in that spot? It's kind of a fun moment, whether you're the kid and you're driving out there with your mom or dad and you pull off the side of the road, you're 16, get up, toss you the keys, switch spaces. I saw a family do that the other day at a traffic light, and I thought, it just doesn't really seem like a really smart way of teaching this whole principle of like doing it at the red light. And they're like, I don't know, it seemed a little inconsistent to me, but whatever, we're at the traffic light, the door's open, what's going on, Young kid walks around, mom walks around, tosses in the keys. I'm like, okay, here, that's fine, all right, good. Keys are a delegation of authority of the kingdom, and this is important, that means the specific reign of King Jesus. I understand that it might seem like we're in the deep weeds here, but this is really important. This is why we're kind of setting up this progression here so that we understand what this is rooted in, what does it mean and what does it not mean. The keys are a delegation of authority of the kingdom, a very specific reign. Here's what I'm getting at. Whenever I hear this verse in just kind of out there in Christian living, usually maybe someone's talking about, it's usually like binding and loosing, right? And that's a common way that people are praying, and it's almost like we see this verse and sometimes it gets misunderstood and sometimes it gets ignored, and so it's like sometimes we look at it and we're like, I don't even know what that means, and we just forget about it. But it's really important because he said, I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom. And we're like, yeah, that sounds weird. I'm not doing that. That doesn't seem like the response he's going for, right? I'm going to build my church. The gates of hell will not be able to withstand it. Here are the keys. Whatever you bind on earth, bound in heaven. Loose on earth, loose in heaven. We're like, yeah, binding and loosing. That sounds kind of weird. So no thanks, Jesus. Not the reaction he's going for. But nor is it the reaction he's going for where we take this and we go, oh, binding and loosing. Got it. Those words are useful. And then from then on, we're running around just binding stuff, loosing stuff. I bind those trans fats in this donut, and I loose the spirit of the education lottery, and I, bind long traffic, and it gets silly. And nowhere in this context are demons and spirits being discussed. I'm not saying they're not relevant. I'm just saying that's not what he's talking about primarily. What he's talking about primarily is what? The kingdom, right? He will build his church one believer at a time on that bedrock, that foundation of conviction that Jesus is true and every word he speaks is real and right and true and good. On that bedrock, he will build his church. His church will expand. His kingdom will grow. The gates of hell will not be able to withstand it. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to give you the keys of authority of the kingdom so that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. He's not talking about your parking space. He's talking about the advance of the kingdom, right? Another piece that I think really sheds a lot of light on understanding when he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven is, yeah, man, the grammar in here is kind of jumbly. It's a little bit difficult to kind of parse out, but it's a really, really valuable point to understand that the tense is a future perfect tense. So in other words, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Now, how does that work? That means this is not just all of the individual Christians running around binding, loosing, you know, like the Wild West. No, this is the church keeping in step with the king as he advances his kingdom, walking in intimacy and belief and conviction that this Jesus is with me. He's speaking. His word is active and true. His spirit is moving through me. I'm listening. I'm paying attention. I'm perceiving what it is that he's doing in his kingdom right around me so that what I bind, what I loose, how I pray will have been bound and loosed in heaven. It's consistent with the advance of his kingdom in this situation. You see what I'm saying? So there's a consistency of how God is moving according to the truth and the reality of his kingdom that is disobedient to the culture around us, but is consistent with the heart of God, that his kingdom would advance. Does that make sense? So we are in a situation where in the world events, and we realize there are some things going on here that are not consistent with the realities of the kingdom of God. And what we're being invited into is a church that's expanding, a kingdom that's expanding. He's given us the keys of authority to pray consistently with the kingdom and to bring that kingdom about as an expression on the earth. It's not so we can just kind of fire off whatever spirit or whatever issue or challenge or whatever we're going through. It's the advance of the kingdom that's at stake. It's the delegation of authority of a specific reign of the king. So, for example, I've been reading about the church in Ukraine, specifically the Alliance Church in Ukraine over this past couple of years, and all of the horrors that are being experienced by really both Ukrainians and Russians and many people, others who are caught in the middle of all of this. And I don't know if you can kind of get this feeling like maybe at the beginning it sort of felt like there's a good guy and there's a bad guy, and then just not too long you kind of get in, you realize, everyone's losing, everyone's suffering, and people who are, victims of cruel orders, whether they're on the receiving end of a bullet or on the firing end of a bullet, are experiencing a tragedy that should break our hearts. And when you see this unfold, especially when it started, we as the church, even as a church, our hearts broke, and we were praying for Ukraine, and then now it's been a year or two, and it's not really quite on the front of our mind as it was, but it's still happening. And I'm not shaming anybody here. I'm just saying this is kind of how it works for us. We get alerted to something, we pray, we respond, and then it sort of falls off and we forget. But meanwhile, that tragedy is still unfolding. So people who are the church that God is building, one believer at a time, people that Jesus has looked to and said, I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on the earth will have been loosed in heaven. Isn't it true that he probably expects us to pray in accordance with his kingdom in those world events? Isn't it true that he's put those keys of authority in our hand as the church, and that we are living under the kingship, the lordship, and under the principles of a kingdom that is in total contrast to what we're seeing unfold? Shouldn't we lean into that? Again, I'm not saying that to shame anybody. I'm just using this as an example that when we see in the world, whether it's next door or on the news across the world, something that is totally inconsistent with the realities of God, the King, and his kingdom, then we take that authority seriously and we pray and we together speak what has been spoken in heaven for the binding of what's wrong and the loosing of what's right. So what is God doing in the midst of that? He's building his church. That's what he's doing. There's a story about a woman and her 2 kids when it all broke loose. And they were trying to get from one city, fleeing where they were living that was under attack, to the next door city. And there's only one way to get across, and there's a bridge that's there. And it was called the Bridge of Death because everyone who came across it was shot. But she was desperate. She didn't know what else to do, and she couldn't leave her kids there in the city that's being bombed. And so she grabs her 2 kids and she makes a break for it. She runs across the bridge. And somehow she makes it on the other side of the bridge, and all of the people are just astonished. They can't even believe it, that she just made it across. And they're like, we're amazed. How did that happen? And where's the man who was running with you? She says, no, there's just the 3 of us. No, there was a man that was running with you the whole way. Where'd he go? There was no man. Well, of course there was. So we can pray that God will do things that are just miraculous and unexpected, that protection, that preservation, that care would be loosed for them, right? And that the enemy's plans would be bound. The Alliance Church in Ukraine, one of the things that's been happening is that when all of it started, a lot of the members fled. And the result was, suddenly, there was a lot of space. And the next result was that suddenly that space was filled, but now the churches were filled with 90% unbelievers who were looking for God. And in the closing months of 2022, over 5 new Alliance churches were planted in that region. Why? Because God is building his church in direct defiance to the enemy and his plans for this world. And he's given the keys of the kingdom to people whose lives are built on that foundation of conviction that Jesus, and only Jesus, is the hope of mankind. And so we have the authority delegated to us not to misunderstand it or to ignore or to use for ourselves, but to wield for the good of people that God is passionate about. I have to skip over a bunch of things. Let me close with this from A.W. Tozer. An assembly of Christians, an assembly of true Christians is a church. It's a group of saved persons, however small, who meets in Christ's name and recognizes his presence, forms a true cell in his body, and enjoys the full power and authority of Christ himself. However humble the external circumstances, if Christ is present, the place is a holy temple, and every believer a priest before the altar. Each single cell is an organic part of the larger body and joined to the whole and the Lord who indwells it by the life of the indliving Spirit. The church is the temple in which the Spirit of God dwells, the body of which Christ is the head, the medium through which he works for the reclamation of mankind. He's given us, the church, the keys to the kingdom. That yes, we would pray and yes, we would speak, binding what doesn't belong in the kingdom, loosing what is free-flowing in the kingdom, according to what he's already established in heaven. The closing verse that we read in this is a little bit curious. Because after all of that, he says, oh, hey, don't tell anyone it's me. Really? Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone he was the Messiah. Just seems like we went through an awful lot of important stuff there, Jesus. You know, it's red letters. It's right there in Dan's new big letter Bible. Why are you saying now, hey, don't tell anybody? You know, that's always a little bit mysterious, and I know that the normal answer, and I think it's true, is that it wasn't time. You know, it wasn't time. Jesus was strategic. He knew what he was doing. He knew when what needed to happen. I think also it was possible, very possible, that the disciples weren't ready themselves. In other words, if they had run out right then, at that moment, and said, hey, everybody, Jesus is the Messiah, then what would come after them would be so great, they would not be able to withstand it. Right? But now, we do get to tell everyone that Jesus is the Messiah. Right? Because Jesus has gone to the cross. He has defeated death and hell. He has been raised from the dead. He has poured out his Holy Spirit. He has given us this word. And he has pulled us together as a church. And therefore now, when we say Jesus is the Messiah, whatever comes against us, not only will we be able to withstand it, but we are now marching as a part of his kingdom, and the gates of hell can't withstand it. So one of the reasons why we come to the table, Paul says, is that as often as you eat this bread and you drink this cup, you're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. We're saying Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. He was sent here to die, and he did. And he rose from the dead, and he's victorious, and he's given us the keys of the kingdom, and he's filled us with his Spirit, and he's given us his word, and he's making us his church, and his church is advancing, and we get to be a part of it. Long live the King. It's part of what we say here at the table. If you are with us this morning, and that's the conviction of your heart, you just love Jesus, this table is for you. You don't have to be a member here. This can be your first time here. If you're joining us online, you can gather some elements where you are and participate with us that way, bread and cup. Because this is not the table of Northridge Church or of the Christian Missionary Alliance. It's the table of the Lord Jesus Christ. If that is not your conviction, if that's not where you stand, if this morning you say, I don't know who Jesus is, he's not that, then I'm asking you, look more closely. See him more clearly. He's exactly who he promises you he is. Change your mind. Change your heart right here, right now, today. Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I don't understand all of what you're saying or doing here, but I know that one thing is true. This table's for you.